Between 1831 and 1847, from Charleston to New Orleans, 17 documented cases surfaced of young women, each apparently from nowhere, appearing in society with immaculate manners, sudden wealth, and no traceable childhood. Their origins stopped at age 10, their paper trails began with perfection, and their disappearances, when they came, were quiet. Each shared one name whispered behind parlor doors and courthouse walls alike, the Madame of Saint Vernis. Her given name was Celestine Laroque, a figure whose existence flickered between charity and commerce, refinement and crime. She called her institution Maison Saint Vernis, a finishing academy for orphaned girls of good family. But private ledgers later recovered from burned trunks described something closer to an assembly line, one that converted stolen identities into social currency. What she sold was not flesh but lineage, the illusion of purity, of breeding, of legitimacy. And the men who purchased from her, merchants newly rich from cotton, overseers who had clawed into ownership, traders who needed wives of pedigree, paid fortunes for a fiction that made their wealth respectable. The trail begins in 1829. A heatwave smothered the Louisiana parishes. Within the tangled jasmine of Britannia Street stood a shuttered two-story house, its brass plate reading, Maison Saint Vernis, private academy for young ladies. No laughter escaped its walls. Neighbors heard only recitations, the sound of a cane striking wood, and once in a while singing, muffled and strange. Celestine Laroque arrived that autumn with impeccable letters of introduction, all later proven forgeries. She was 34, fluent in French and deceit, and claimed descent from a vanished Creole line. Her fortune, small but sufficient, came from inheritances no one could verify. Yet within months, she had purchased 3 children from bankruptcy auctions, each light, skinned, intelligent, and unprotected, and registered them as orphans of good breeding. Their lives were rewritten in ink and sealed with wax. Their birth names were burned with their old clothes. From that day forward, they were pupils of refinement, future wives for men who could afford legitimacy. Before we step deeper into the house where identity itself became merchandise, tell me, where are you hearing this from? Are you in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, or beyond? Leave your state or city in the comments, and subscribe, because what follows will unearth a system your history books buried. Twice in the comments write this phrase to seal the truth within you: the past was rewritten. By the spring of 1830, the Maison Saint Vernis operated like a cloistered kingdom. Its high shutters never opened. Its garden grew wild and fragrant with neglect, and its inhabitants, 9 girls by then, moved like ghosts through a rhythm not their own. Each was between 10 and 12, all of them documented as orphans of respectable lineage, though every birth certificate, baptismal record, and letter of guardianship had been inked by Celestine's own hand. Her genius was not brutality but reconstruction. She did not simply erase a past, she built a better one. Each girl received a new family, complete with ancestors drawn from defunct parish records and signatures forged from 18th century documents purchased by the stack from courthouse clerks drunk on brandy. She crafted letters of condolence to herself, signed by imaginary relatives who had perished in fever, and filed them dutifully with notaries. By the time any investigator traced a paper trail, it looped back to ashes or saints long dead. Inside the academy, lessons began before dawn. The girls learned diction from a woman once employed as a stage actress in Paris. They practiced posture until their spines trembled. They read psalms aloud to perfect elocution, and when they stumbled, Celestine corrected them not with blows, but with silence, a punishment worse than pain. She trained them in the art of composure. A lady's face, she told them, must be her mask and her mirror. Reflect what they wish to see. Reveal nothing. Each morning they repeated it aloud until the words became marrow. They were taught to pour tea without trembling, to measure flour without waste, to recite the genealogies of New Orleans' eldest families as if reciting scripture. To the world, they would appear as women of education and modest fortune, suitable wives for ambitious men. What Celestine created was not girls of virtue, but commodities of credibility. No priest ever questioned her guardianship. Her donations to the church were generous, her attendance impeccable. Priests blessed her, charity, magistrates signed her papers, merchants greeted her as Madame Celestine, the benefactor of unfortunate girls. In truth, Every ledger she kept told another story, a list of acquisitions and expenditures, measured in names. Next to each, a small notation in red ink, a future buyer. And yet, none suspected that the woman they dined beside on holy days had turned the sacrament of marriage into a marketplace. In 1832, the first graduate of Maison Saint Verny made her debut. Her name, on paper, was Isabelle Darmont, a supposed Creole orphan descended from a Saint Domingue plantation family destroyed by revolution. Her skin was pale, her accent delicate, her manners flawless. Every inch of her presence seemed authentic, even to those who prided themselves on sniffing out impostors. The introduction took place at a charity gala in New Orleans, hosted by a shipping magnate whose fortune rested on human cargo. Celestine Vacheray attended as Isabelle's patroness, dressed in widow's black and pearls that caught candlelight like small ghosts. She spoke little, smiled only when necessary, and guided Isabelle through the crowd like a general positioning her finest soldier. Whispers followed. Who is she? Her French is perfect. Saint Domingue, you say, and then silence, as if everyone silently agreed not to ask too much. In New Orleans, a good story was as valuable as a good marriage, and Celestine provided both. Within months, Isabelle was engaged to a man 20 years her senior, a cotton merchant with enough money to buy refinement, but not enough to inherit it. The union was celebrated as romantic, respectable, and socially perfect. No one asked where the girl had come from, only how she had been raised so well. Celestine received her payment quietly, not in coins, but in shares, partnership in the merchant's export company. To society, she remained a guardian of lost girls in truth. She was now an investor in the trade that had orphaned them. But behind the curtains of Saint Verny, something shifted. The remaining girls began to understand that their graduations were transactions. They overheard fragments, prices, destinations, arrangements. One girl tried to escape. Celestine found her at the docks, barefoot, her forged papers clutched to her chest like scripture. She did not beat her. She only took the papers back, tore them once, and said, "You cannot exist without me." After that, none ran again. By 1835, Celestine's operation had expanded to 3 parishes. The women she raised had married planters, lawyers, and magistrates. Every one of them carried a name she had invented, a lineage she had sold, and every one of them owed her their silence. In 1836, a Jesuit priest named Father Armand Duval began to take notice of the strange perfection surrounding Maison Saint Verny. He had encountered several of Celestine Vacheray's graduates. In confession, all recently married, all repeating curious phrases. God has given me a new life. Or, my past was purified by his will. None could name their baptismal parish. None could recall a family grave. Father Duval was not a suspicious man by nature, but he had spent years cataloguing births and deaths in the archdiocese, and he knew the records by heart. There were no Darmonts, no Lestres, no Valcourts in the decades Celestine claimed. Entire bloodlines had appeared overnight, as if conjured. He paid a visit to Maison Saint Verny one humid afternoon, under the pretense of offering catechism lessons. Celestine received him with her usual serenity, barely 40 now, though her composure made her ageless. The parlor was immaculate. Portraits of invented ancestors lined the walls, each painted with the same pale hands and knowing eyes. "My girls," she said, "require discipline of the soul. The world outside bruises innocence too easily." Her tone was gentle, but it left no space for questions. Father Duval noticed something odd. Every girl avoided mirrors. They passed by them without a glance, as if reflection itself had become forbidden. He left unsettled. That night, he wrote in his journal, "There is an academy that manufactures virtue the way a mint manufactures coins. But whose face is struck upon them, and who spends them?" When he returned a week later, he found the house shuttered, the brass plate polished to blindness. Celestine was away on charitable business. The girls were not seen again until months later, married, renamed, relocated. Duval tried to raise the matter with his superiors, but Celestine's donations to the church silenced inquiry. One bishop told him kindly, "Father, a woman who gives so generously to orphans cannot be evil. Let Providence judge her." So he waited and watched. By the end of that year, a trunk washed ashore on the Mississippi, its lock rusted open. Inside were burned fragments of correspondence, half-sealed contracts, charred ledgers, and the faint outline of a name in red ink. Lot 6, reserved. Father Duval would never learn who Lot 6 was, but history would. The trunk that surfaced on the riverbank in early 1837 should have sunk unnoticed. It was a plain wooden chest, iron-bound and water-stained, half filled with silt and riverweed. But a fisherman pried it open, curious about the glint of wax seals inside. When he realized the letters were written in French and bore the mark of Maison Saint-Vernis, he sold the contents to a bookseller in the quarter. Within days, the fragments found their way to Father Duval. He spread the damp papers across his small desk by candlelight. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, exact, Celestine Vacheret's. The letters read like ledgers disguised as correspondence, lists of pupils, notations of dowries, signatures of men whose reputations anchored the city. Dates were aligned with weddings. Amounts were listed beside initials. The evidence was incomplete, but the pattern clear. The academy was not a refuge, it was an exchange. Duval began copying the fragments into a private notebook, preserving what the river had not erased. Each night he inked another revelation, that several of the graduates were traced to plantations whose heirs had died conveniently young, that the names in Celestine's documents matched no parish registry, that the red ink notations, Lot 5, Lot 6, Lot 7 corresponded to planned unions still months away. He sent anonymous warnings to 3 families, pleading that their engagements be reconsidered. Only one replied, a curt note from a lawyer who threatened legal action for defamation. 2 weeks later, the bookseller who had handled the trunk was found dead in his shop, a candle overturned near the ashes of what had been those same papers. The coroner called it an accident. Father Duval called it a message. Celestine Vacheret returned to New Orleans shortly after, serene as ever, her name on the donation rolls of every parish. The trunk, she said to curious officials, must have belonged to a former servant, God rest him. No charges were filed, but whispers grew louder. Merchants who had once courted her began to withdraw from public dinners. Women crossed themselves when she passed, and inside the academy walls, the girls practiced their recitations more quietly, as if the river itself had begun to listen. Something had been exposed, but not enough to stop her. Not yet. By the summer of 1837, Father Duval knew he could not fight Maison Saint-Vernis alone. The church would not act, the law would not touch her, and his sermons, cautious parables about the buying of souls, only made his parishioners uneasy. He needed light, not whispers. That light came in the form of Etienne Morel, a Creole journalist recently returned from Paris, whose small newspaper, Le Courrier du Sud, specialized in printing what polite society preferred to forget. Duval approached him at dusk, in the courtyard of St. Louis Cathedral, handing him a bundle wrapped in linen, the surviving fragments of Celestine Vacheret's letters. Morel read through the night. By morning, he looked both terrified and enthralled. This woman, he said, has built a market on illusion. She traffics in ancestry itself. Together, they began their investigation quietly. Morel visited auction houses, tracing bills of sale that bore the same flourished handwriting as Celestine's contracts. Duval cross-checked baptismal registries, discovering entire pages rewritten in identical ink. Slowly, a map emerged. Names, estates, marriage licenses, all tied back to one immaculate signature. The deeper they dug, the stranger the coincidences. Every man who had purchased one of Celestine's pupils as a wife or ward had soon after received large credit extensions from her associates. It was not merely marriage, it was money laundering through matrimony. Morel prepared a 3-part exposé titled The Saint-Vernis Transactions. Before publication, he sent drafts to trusted printers in Baton Rouge, fearing local presses might be silenced. But days before the issue went to print, his office was ransacked. His clerk vanished. The printing plates were smashed. That same week, Celestine hosted a charity banquet for widows of the flood. She donated enough silver to rebuild a chapel roof, and publicly thanked Father Duval for his moral guidance. The applause was thunderous. Morel watched from the back of the hall, his hat low, fury in his jaw. "She's untouchable," he whispered. Duval looked at her across the candlelit tables and saw not invincibility, but calculation. The more she gave to the poor, the more invisible her crimes became. That night, they made a pact. If they could not bring her down with paper, They would do it with testimony. And one of her graduates, long presumed vanished, had just written to Father Duval ready to speak. The letter arrived folded 3 times, sealed with a wax imprint too crude for the refinement of Maison Saint-Vernis. The handwriting trembled, the ink watered with sweat. It bore no return address, only a line that read, "Father, I was lot 6. Father Duval opened it by candlelight, his hands steady but his breath uneven. Inside, the woman, who signed herself Madeleine, described what had happened after her graduation. The tale was written in fragments, as if she could not face each sentence whole. She spoke of a plantation near Opolisses, of being given a new name, of papers that declared her born in Bordeaux, adopted by Celestine Vacheray out of charity. Every record, birth, education, and travel, had been composed by the same unseen hand. Madeleine did not linger on cruelty. She wrote instead of erasure. She took not only our pasts, Father, but our ability to prove we ever had one. Morel read the letter twice, his journalist's instinct sharpening. If this is genuine, she can give us details only someone inside could know. Ledger marks, signatures, dates. He sent a coded note arranging a meeting in Lafayette under the guise of interviewing a former pupil of the Saint-Vernis Academy. When they found her, she was living under a borrowed name, teaching music to children who believed she was European. Her posture was perfect, her voice calm, but when Morel mentioned Celestine's name, the teacup in her hand cracked in 2. Over hours she recounted how Celestine had taught them to forget themselves, how every mirror in the house had been draped, until we no longer recognized what we were before. She remembered being made to copy a new signature until her old one disappeared from memory. Duval asked, softly, "Why now?" Madeleine's reply was a whisper, "Because she is preparing more girls younger, because the river gave back the truth once. It may again." They agreed to protect her, to hide her testimony until it could be delivered safely to the authorities. But 2 nights later, when Morel returned to confirm the details, her boarding room was empty. The landlady said a carriage had taken her away, escorted by a woman dressed in mourning black. Celestine Vacheray had found her. The disappearance of Madeleine shattered what little calm remained between Father Duval and Etienne Morel. For days they searched, interviewing carriage drivers, questioning hotel clerks, tracing signatures on receipts. But every trail ended in polite shrugs and empty ledgers. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Then, late one evening, Duval returned to his rectory to find his study door ajar. His papers were untouched, his crucifix upright, but on his desk lay a single object, a folded white glove, embroidered with gold thread. Inside it, a note written in Celestine's hand, "Some souls are not yours to save." He understood the message. She knew everything. Morel, meanwhile, began noticing shadows that didn't belong. At night, when he left the printing shop, a carriage wheel echoed one beat behind his step. Twice he caught a glimpse of a woman's silhouette reflected in rain-puddled streets. Small, poised, deliberate, he armed himself with a pistol and slept in shifts. Despite fear, they pressed on. Morel published a veiled editorial in Le Courrier du Sud, disguised as allegory. There exists a garden where flowers bloom without roots, cultivated by a hand that fears the sun. Readers whispered, clergy frowned, and merchants grew restless. Celestine, he knew, would understand the message was meant for her. Days later, the newspaper's main typesetter resigned, muttering that polite society had limits to curiosity. The morning after, the presses were seized for unpaid debts that had never existed. Someone had purchased silence with gold. Father Duval tried to appeal to higher clergy again, but his letters went missing. His sermons drew fewer listeners. Parishioners began to avoid his gaze, and one night he found a small envelope nailed to the church door. Inside, an illustration of Saint Veronica, patron of false faces. Celestine was tightening her net. Still, one thing remained beyond her control: the river. The Mississippi, restless and merciless, had begun eroding the very land around Maison Saint-Vernis. The townsfolk said it was punishment, that the earth itself was reclaiming secrets buried too deep. Duval and Morel decided their only chance was to reach Baton Rouge, carrying the surviving papers and copies of Madeleine's letter. If they could not save her, they could at least expose the woman who had turned charity into commerce. But they were not the only travelers on that road. The road to Baton Rouge was half mud, half memory, washed out by the spring rains and lined with willow roots that clawed at passing wheels. Father Duval and E.T. and Morel traveled by night in a hired wagon, their only cargo a locked chest containing the remaining fragments of Maison Saint Verne's ledgers. The documents were damp but legible, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. The air was thick with insects and the smell of rot from the swollen river. Each creak of the wheels sounded too loud. Morel drove in silence, scanning the road behind them. He had seen a lantern there an hour earlier, steady, unwavering, not the flicker of a traveler's torch. Whoever followed them had patience. "Do you think she'd risk open pursuit?" Morel asked. Duval shook his head. "She doesn't pursue, she anticipates." At the next crossing, they stopped to rest their horse at a small ferry post. The ferryman, an old freedman with clouded eyes, eyed their cargo warily. "River's high tonight," he said. "She's got a mind of her own. Chooses who crosses and who don't." As they waited, Morel noticed something floating by the dock, an empty carriage wheel, half burned. He crouched, touching the scorched rim. It was marked with the same gold embroidery pattern that Celestine's glove had borne. "She's already ahead of us," he muttered. They crossed in silence, the ferry groaning under the current. On the opposite shore, the road split. One path led to the safety of the capital, the other toward the parishes where Celestine's influence still reigned. The signs had been tampered with. Night deepened. The air hummed. Somewhere behind them, a single horse's hoof struck stone. Duval whispered a prayer and clutched the chest closer. "If we fall," he said, "someone must find these papers. They must." Morel nodded. "Then if it comes to that, I'll make sure you live to deliver them." But before dawn, the wagon lurched violently. A rope stretched taut across the road snapped the axle. The horse screamed and bolted into the trees. The chest slid from the wagon bed, cracking open, its contents spilling into the rising floodwater. Duval fell to his knees, reaching for the papers as they drifted downstream, and from the mist ahead a figure stepped into view. Calm, composed, wearing mourning black, she emerged from the fog as though the river itself had shaped her from vapor. Celestine Laroque, dressed in black silk, dry despite the rain. Her veil fluttered with the current's breath. Behind her stood two silent men in long coats, their boots sinking into the mud without protest. Father Duval froze. Etienne Morel lifted his pistol, but Celestine only smiled, tilting her head as if amused by a child's rebellion. "You should have stayed in your pulpit, Father," she said softly. "You preach about salvation, yet you cannot tell when you stand before someone who creates it." Duval rose, soaked and shaking. "You create nothing but ghosts. You steal names, families, faith itself." She took a measured step closer, eyes calm. "Faith is only belief repeated until it becomes truth. That is all I have done. Made the world believe in better blood. You call it deceit. I call it survival." Morel cocked the hammer. "Release the woman you took, Madeleine." Celestine looked genuinely puzzled. "Ah, the one who forgot how to be silent. She begged to come home." Her tone was almost kind. "You see, gentlemen, every story requires an ending. I simply provide the proper ones." The river surged, dark and impatient. Duval could feel the chest's papers dissolving in the current, years of evidence turning to pulp. "Then let the river judge," he said. He stepped forward suddenly, shoving the cracked chest into the flood. Morel fired, a warning shot meant to scatter the men behind her. But lightning flashed at the same instant, drowning the sound. When the glare faded, Celestine was gone. Only her veil remained, caught in the reeds like a discarded lie. Morel searched frantically, but there was no trace, no footprints, no splash. Nothing. The two men who had stood behind her had vanished as well, as if the night had swallowed them whole. Duval stared at the veil. "She's not dead," he murmured. "People like her don't die. They adapt." They gathered what few pages the water had spared. Most were unreadable, ink bled into grey veins. Still one fragment remained legible, a single line written in her precise hand, "Perfection must outlive its maker," and beneath it, a name neither man recognized. Lot 9 reserved. By dawn, the flood had begun to retreat, leaving the riverbanks strewn with branches, torn cloth, and the remnants of ink-blurred papers that once could have damned Maison Saint Verne. Teen Morrill sat by the wrecked wagon, hands black with mud and frustration, watching the current drag the last fragments away. Father Duval stood at the edge of the water, clutching the single surviving sheet, the one marked Lot 9. Reserved, it was dated 2 months ahead. Beneath the neat red ink were initials AL and a parish seal from Ascension County, an inland settlement several days north. "She's starting again," Duval said quietly. Morrill looked up, hollow-eyed. "After all this, she rebuilds." "She doesn't rebuild," Duval replied. "She relocates." They left the broken wagon behind and made their way on foot, following trade routes northward. The floodwaters had turned roads into mirror-like channels. The reflection of the sky followed them everywhere, like the gaze of something that refused to look away. In towns along the way, whispers preceded them. A finishing academy, newly opened on the edge of Ascension, run by a Madame Laroque. French, charitable, discreet, the pattern was unmistakable. By the time they reached the parish, the house stood half hidden by magnolias, its paint new, its shutters white as innocence. A brass plate by the gate read simply Maison Laroque. For the education of young ladies. Celestine had changed her name again. Morrill wanted to rush the gates to confront her, to demand justice. But Duval restrained him. "Evidence first," he said. "This time we bring her down by her own hand, not ours." They took rooms in a nearby inn and began to observe. Each morning they counted the girls entering the property, 8, then 9, then 11. Each evening, lanterns glowed in the upper windows long past midnight. A carriage bearing the crest of a wealthy sugar planter arrived twice that week, staying just long enough for tea. To the townsfolk, the new academy was a blessing, an institution of refinement for orphans and widows' daughters. To Duval and Morrill, it was the same machine reborn under a different name, and somewhere within those painted walls Lot 9 waited, unaware that her life was already written in red. The following Sunday, Father Duval entered Maison Laroque under the guise of a charitable priest inspecting schools for the bishop's office. Celestine greeted him at the door with the same serene composure that had once deceived judges and governors alike. She wore grey silk and a veil of lace fine enough to disguise the faint scar along her jaw, the mark left by shattered glass from the storm that was supposed to have destroyed her. "Father Duval," she said with a calm that was almost mocking, "the church honors us. Please, come in." Inside, everything gleamed with new wealth. Fresh wallpaper hid the damp marks of recent construction. Portraits of anonymous ancestors watched from gilded frames. The air smelled of rosewater and chalk. Girls moved silently between rooms, heads bowed, eyes dulled into the same mechanical obedience Duval had seen years earlier in Maison Saint-Vernis. He forced his expression to remain placid, but every breath was rage disguised as reverence. "Your academy seems a blessing to the parish," he murmured, studying the girls as they passed. One, barely 13, curtsied with a trembling grace that did not come from innocence but from conditioning. Her wrists bore faint red welts, half hidden beneath lace cuffs. Celestine's voice floated through the hall. "Discipline and devotion, Father. They must be taught both, or they are lost." Meanwhile, Teen Morrill worked from the shadows. Disguised as a clerk for a trading company, he had secured lodging across the street, where he could observe the comings and goings. Over the next 3 weeks, he documented every carriage, every visitor, every delivery. Wealthy men from Baton Rouge, brokers from Natchez, and one prominent judge, all arriving quietly, leaving before dawn. At night, Duval smuggled fragments of evidence to him, letters of guardianship signed in multiple hands, baptismal papers bearing the same priest's seal, tuition ledgers that listed girls only by lot numbers. The code was unmistakable: L1 Blanche, age 9, L3 Colette, age 10, L9 Marianne. Lot 9 again. The child from the washed-away paper had survived the storm of records and been reborn on parchment. Duval's sermons grew darker. He spoke in church of wolves in women's clothing, of sins washed clean in counterfeit baptism. Parishioners whispered, but none dared question Madame Laroque. She hosted their charity balls, funded their schools, blessed their reputations. Duval and Morrill knew they had enough to expose her, but not enough to survive doing it. Still, they planned the unthinkable: to pull the curtain from her house while it was full, during the next parish gala, before the eyes of those who had profited from her lies. The gala at Maison Laroque began under candlelight and thunderclouds. Both fitting, Duval thought. The storm outside mirrored the one inside his chest. The guests arrived in satin and perfume, their laughter gilded with money and guilt. The house, that immaculate shell of respectability, glowed brighter than the church across the road. Madame Celestine Laroque, formerly Celestine Duperret, formerly the widow Saint Vernis, descended the staircase like a queen, the light following her. Her gown was ivory silk, her voice smooth as wine. To education, to virtue, and to the prosperity of our blessed parish, she toasted. Crystal rang, and the orchestra began. Behind the orchestra pit, hidden among the hired staff, Etienne Morel moved with calculated calm. He wore a servant's livery, his hands gloved to hide the burn scars from the old fire. In his pocket lay the folded documents, evidence of her crimes, ledgers, baptismal frauds, lists of girls, loaned to patrons. Duval, standing near the dais, spoke softly to the mayor. "Your Excellency," he said, handing him a sealed envelope for the bishop's attention. "It contains matters of grave concern." Then, before the mayor could open it, Duval turned toward the gathered crowd. "Madame Laroque," he called out, his voice slicing through the music. "Would you permit a blessing upon this house before the evening proceeds?" Her smile didn't falter. "Of course, Father." He stepped forward, but instead of prayer, he opened the parish ledger, her ledger, and read aloud, "Lot 3, Colette, Evangeline, Lot Marianne." A murmur rippled through the guests. The words had the cadence of commerce, not of charity. Duval's voice grew louder. "Sold not to salvation, but to sin, the daughters of this parish. Catalogue bartered, baptized in deceit." The orchestra fell silent. The mayor's face drained of color as he unfolded the envelope. Inside were identical documents, bearing the signatures of men now standing in that very room. Celestine's mask cracked. Her voice, once honeyed, turned sharp. "Father Duval, you speak blasphemy!" "Then let God strike me," he answered. Lightning split the sky, the chandeliers flickered, then went dark. Gasps filled the room. When light returned, Morel was at the foot of the stairs, his pistol leveled at Celestine. "For Blanche," he said quietly. But the shot never came, because from behind Celestine, a young girl stepped forward, barefoot, shaking. It was Marianne. "Don't," she whispered. "She doesn't fear death. She fears being seen." And in that moment, Celestine's empire began to die, not by bullet, but by exposure. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. The guests stood frozen, wine glasses trembling, whispers strangled in their throats. Outside, thunder cracked like a divine gavel. Celestine remained on the staircase, her ivory gown glowing ghost-like in the flashes of lightning. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with the poise of a woman who had built her life upon performance, she descended slowly, one deliberate step at a time. "My dear child," she said to Marianne, her tone dripping with false tenderness, "you don't understand what's being said here. These men are confused, driven mad by guilt, no doubt. Come to me." But Marianne didn't move. Her eyes, hollow and too old for her face, stayed fixed on the woman who had stolen her name, her future, her soul. "You told me I was bought," she whispered. "You said I belonged to you because no one else wanted me." Celestine's fingers tightened around her fan until it cracked. The mask she had worn for years began to slip, not the silk or powder, but the control. Duval raised the ledger high. "There is no redemption in concealment," he declared. "Your house stands on bones and blessings that were never yours to give." The mayor stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Madame Laroque, these documents bear my seal." "How did you?" "Because you signed them," she snapped, turning on him. "You and every man who paid to keep your sins wrapped in silk." A murmur turned into a roar. Faces once smiling now hardened into horror or denial. Several men slipped toward the exits, tripping over chairs as though fleeing a plague. Morel advanced a step, his pistol still raised, but Marianne placed her small hand over his. "If you kill her," she said softly, "she'll die a story. If you let her live, she'll die the truth." Celestine's face drained of color. For the first time she seemed human, small, cornered, mortal. Outside, bells from the parish began to ring. Duval's doing, calling witnesses from the town. Within minutes, lanterns flickered through the rain as townsfolk arrived, drawn by the commotion. When the doors burst open, Celestine tried to run, but her silk shoes slipped on the marble, and she fell, not dead, not wounded, just stripped of all her illusions. By morning, Maison Laroque was no longer a school. It was a crime scene. By the week's end, Maison Laroque had become a pilgrimage site for outrage. Parishioners, once eager to dine in Celestine's parlor, now spat her name in the marketplace. The iron gate stood ajar, guarded by militiamen, while the rooms inside, stripped of portraits and perfume, reeked of mildew, candle soot, and secrets unearthed too late. Celestine herself was confined to a guest chamber of the parish courthouse. She refused food, refused confession, refused even to answer to her name. When asked to sign the arrest record, she scrawled Madame Laroque in trembling ink, then crossed it out and wrote no one. Father Duval presided not as judge but as witness. He'd surrendered the ledgers, the letters, the forged baptismal seals. Etienne Morel, his face drawn and sleepless, testified with bitter precision. Dates, payments, the names of men who'd whispered absolution through bribes. But it was Marianne's testimony that sealed everything. The courtroom was packed when she entered, escorted by 2 nuns from the refuge house. Her dress was plain, her hair neatly braided, her hands steady. When asked if she knew the accused, she looked at Celestine without flinching. She told us we were gifts. Marianne said quietly, that we were chosen, that if we obeyed we could become ladies. But every lesson was a wound, every prayer was a price. Celestine's lips parted, perhaps to deny it, but no sound came. The hall was silent except for the rain against the windows. Marianne continued, her voice rising like a hymn-turned weapon. She made us kneel and call her mother. But a mother doesn't sell her children. In the crowd, someone began to weep. Others turned their faces away. By dusk, the jury had no need to deliberate. The sentence was read aloud: life imprisonment at St. Genevieve Asylum for the morally corrupt. A poetic irony, a place she had once funded for others. As she was led away, Celestine turned one last time to Duval. You think this ends it? She hissed. There will always be men who want what I gave them, and women who sell it for them. Duval didn't answer. He only crossed himself. Outside, Marianne stood in the courtyard, rain soaking her thin shawl. When Morel approached her, she asked simply, what happens now? He looked toward the grey horizon. Now, he said, we start unlearning everything she taught us. 20 years later, the ruins of Maison Laroque lay half, swallowed by vines and silence. The roof had caved in, the garden, once filled with obedient white lilies, had turned wild and overgrown. Only the stone staircase remained, cracked, moss-covered, leading to nowhere. Locals said the wind that passed through its halls still carried whispers of piano music and girls reciting lessons they never chose to learn. Marianne stood at the gates once more, now a grown woman. The lines around her eyes were gentle but deep, the kind carved by both grief and endurance. She carried a lantern and a folded letter. Duval's handwriting, fading but steady. He had died 3 winters earlier, leaving her the parish records, the ledgers, and a note that read, truth is not enough to heal. Someone must remember. Beside her was Etienne Morel, grey at the temples but still walking with that quiet strength. The pistol was long gone. In its place, he carried a journal bound in cracked leather. The book of every girl they'd found and freed after the fall of Celestine's empire. They entered the ruins in silence. Rain dripped through holes in the ceiling, forming small pools where mirrors once stood. This was her chapel, Marianne said, touching the wall. She used to make us pray here before the lessons. Morel nodded. And now it's yours to reclaim. She set Duval's letter on the stone floor and lit it. The flame flickered orange, then blue, consuming his words until only ash remained. When the fire died, she spoke softly, not to Morel, not to God, but to the ghosts that lingered. We are not what you made of us, she said. We are what survived you. Outside, the rain had stopped. From the distance came the faint hum of a river, wider now, freer since the levees had broken years ago. The flood that once buried Celestine's sins had returned to cleanse them fully. Before leaving, Marianne hung a small wooden sign by the broken gate. It read Maison des Libres, the House of the Free. Years later, travelers would pass the overgrown ruins and ask who the woman in the white dress was that they sometimes saw on the stairs, weeping not in sorrow, but in apology. And those who knew the story would answer softly, "Only what's left of Madame Laroque, remembered but never forgiven." Years passed, and the legend of Maison Laroque transformed from scandal to cautionary tale, retold in whispers at parish schools, in old sermons, in the cautious glances of mothers warning their daughters of gilded promises. The building itself, long since reclaimed by vines and ivy, became a place of strange reverence. Children dared each other to touch the gates, lovers carved initials into the stone steps, unaware of the prayers buried beneath them. But for Marianne, the house never stopped breathing. Now in her 30s, she ran a small refuge in Baton Rouge called Maison des Libres. There were no uniforms, no locked doors, no numbers. The girls there laughed freely, some scarred, some silent, but all unowned. She never told them she had once been Lot 9. She was simply Madame Marianne, the teacher who never raised her hand in anger and who kept her office lit every night until dawn. The walls of the refuge were filled with portraits, not of saints or benefactors, but of the rescued. Each one signed her name under her own likeness, not a number, a defiant ritual of identity. One afternoon, a visitor arrived unannounced, a young journalist from New Orleans, eager to write about the woman who rebuilt freedom from the ashes of scandal. Marianne agreed to speak, but only if the story began with the girls, not her. When asked about Celestine Laroque, she hesitated. "Evil isn't born monstrous," she said finally. "It's made when cruelty learns to speak the language of love." The journalist wrote that line down. It became the title of his article, and within months, donations began pouring in. A new wing was built, dedicated to Father Duval, with a small brass plaque that read, "He lit the match that burned deceit into light." As the years went on, the ruins of Maison Laroque were declared a heritage site, not of glory but of warning. Visitors came not to mourn Celestine, but to honor those who escaped her shadow. On the 25th anniversary of the fire, Marianne returned once more. She placed a single lily on the staircase and whispered, "For those who never found their names." The wind stirred the vines as if in response. A sigh, a rustle, maybe forgiveness, maybe warning. And for the first time, Marianne smiled without guilt. The story had finally ended, not in blood or silence, but in remembrance. Time, as it always does, softened the names but not the wounds. By the turn of the new century, Maison Laroque and its dark mistress had become part of Louisiana folklore, a story told in candlelit parlors and printed in the margins of reformist pamphlets. Historians would later argue whether Celestine Dupré ever truly existed, or whether she was an amalgam of several women who profited from the slave trade's twilight years under the guise of refinement and charity. But the records, the ledgers preserved by Father Duval and Etienne Morel, proved otherwise. They bore her handwriting, her seal, and the same chilling orderliness. Names turned into numbers, faith turned into currency. In 1892, a scholar from Tulane University uncovered the last remaining ledger fragment in a private collection in Natchez. It was water-stained, almost unreadable, but one phrase remained clear at the bottom of the page. "Virtue is not given, it is purchased. C.D." The scholar noted beneath it. The handwriting trembles. Perhaps the author finally doubted her own creed. As for Marianne, her refuge continued long after her death in 1908. The Maison des Libres became the first unofficial home for freed women and orphaned girls across Louisiana. A sanctuary that would evolve, decades later, into a formal institution for the education of black women during Reconstruction. Her portrait still hangs there today, not sainted, not framed in gold, but in simple oak, smiling faintly. Father Duval's writings, discovered posthumously, contained his reflection on the scandal. "We fought monsters with words and paper, but we forgot. Monsters are not slain, they are starved. And to starve them, one must feed the hungry truth." It became a motto engraved above the entrance of Maison des Libres. The ruins of Maison Laroque still stand near Ascension, mostly swallowed by the swamp. Locals claim that on certain humid nights, when the cicadas fall silent, you can hear a woman's voice reciting names, never her own. Some say it's Marianne, ensuring they're remembered. Others swear it's Celestine, counting the souls she lost in her own arithmetic. But to those who know the story, the voice is neither ghost nor curse. It's the echo of a time when sin wore silk, salvation wore scars, and truth at last found its voice. The camera drifts slowly over the swamp at dusk, mist rising, water rippling with the reflections of cypress trees that look like ancient sentinels guarding buried secrets. In the distance, the broken shell of Madame Laroque stands half consumed by vines, its windows black as empty eyes. A woman's voice, soft, aged, unhurried, begins to speak. Once, this house was called a school. Once, its mistress was called a saint. But time has a way of stripping words bare, leaving only what they hide. Here, children prayed to be good while men prayed to be forgiven. And in the silence between those prayers, evil learned to sound like virtue. The camera glides through the ruins, past a shattered mirror reflecting the open sky, past a half-buried crucifix tangled in roots, and up the cracked staircase where the ghosts of girls seem to linger, barefoot, watching, unafraid. They said the river washed her sins away. They said justice was done. But water doesn't forget. It carries what we bury. It whispers to those who will listen. The frame shifts to Marianne's portrait in Maison des Libraries, her smile faint but unbroken, light falling gently across her face. Children's laughter echoes faintly in the background. New voices, free voices. We are not the daughters of shame. We are the heirs of survival. And our freedom was not gifted. It was claimed piece by piece, name by name. Thunder rumbles in the far distance. The ruins fade into dusk. The camera lingers on the old wooden sign nailed to the gate, its letters barely legible through moss and time. Maison des Libraries. The house of the free. The music swells, strings low and mournful, fading into the hum of cicadas and nightbirds. The final image is the staircase under moonlight, now empty yet alive with unseen presence. Some stories end with a death. Ours ends with a beginning, because what was once bought has learned to live unknown. The screen fades to black, and the words appear in silence, inspired by true accounts from 19th century Louisiana, dedicated to the forgotten names. The screen remains black for a moment, letting the echo of the last words fade completely. Then, a faint sound, a heartbeat, slow and steady, emerges beneath the silence. Over it, the narrator's voice returns, calm yet heavy with memory. History doesn't always bury its ghosts. Sometimes it teaches through them. The heartbeat softens into the rhythm of rain. Images begin to appear, archival sketches of 19th century Louisiana, a parish ledger turning its pages, faded portraits of unnamed girls, candle flames reflected in glass. Each image dissolves slowly, as if time itself were exhaling. In every record, every church ledger, every forgotten story, there are still names waiting to be spoken, not saints, not sinners, just lives. And when we remember them, even the silence learns to tell the truth. A slow zoom returns to the swamp. The ruins of Maison Laroque, now bathed in morning light. Mist drifts across the still water, soft as breath. The voice continues. This was never just the story of a woman who deceived the world. It was the story of those who endured her, outlived her, and reclaimed what she tried to own. Their will, their words, their worth. The piano begins, a simple, haunting melody in minor key. The final line comes like a benediction. Evil may build its house on power, but freedom builds its home on memory. The music swells and the screen fades to white. In bold letters, the title appears one last time. The House of the Free. The Fall of Madame Laroque. Beneath it, the credits roll over the image of an open journal lying on a wooden desk. The pages flutter gently in the wind before closing on their own, then silence. Just the sound of cicadas. At the very end, a final line fades in, based on forgotten testimonies recorded in Louisiana 1857-1861. The last frame lingers, a candle burning low beside a single lily. The flame flickers, bends, and finally goes out.